At 50 years old, I wasn't planning to start over, and I definitely wasn't planning to move halfway across the world. But there I was, sitting in a small house just outside Manila, setting up a home office with backup internet, a portable power station, and a full-time remote job, trying to make sure I could still work even if the power went out or the internet went down. 6 months earlier, none of this was even on my mind, because I wasn't planning to leave America. I wasn't planning to fall in love, and I certainly wasn't planning to start over at 50. But sometimes life has a way of changing direction when you least expect it. And part of the reason I wanted to share this story is because I know there are other people out there who might be thinking about making a big life change. Whether it's moving for love, looking for a lower cost of living, or simply wondering if starting over later in life is even possible, and if sharing my experience helps even one person make a more informed decision, then telling this story will have been worth it. Before all of this, I had a normal life in the United States. I had a steady job, a routine that felt comfortable, and while I wasn't wealthy, I wasn't struggling either. I was just a regular guy living a normal life. But after my divorce, things started to feel different. Not in a dramatic way, but more in the quiet moments, like coming home to an empty house or realizing that the future I had pictured for myself wasn't going to look the same anymore. I tried dating again, mostly online, but like a lot of people in their late 40s and early 50s, it wasn't easy, and while I met a few people, nothing really seemed to click, and after a while, I started to feel like maybe this was just how life was going to be, comfortable, stable, but maybe a little quieter than I had once imagined. Then one day, a friend of mine mentioned that he had started dating someone from the Philippines, and at first I didn't think much of it, but he told me how they had been talking every day, how things were going well, and how he was even planning a visit, and I remember feeling curious. Not because I was seriously looking for anything, but just because it was something different, and at that point in my life, different sounded interesting. So out of pure curiosity, I signed up for a dating site, not expecting much, and honestly I didn't even think I would stay on there very long, but then I met her, and what started as a simple conversation slowly turned into something more, and before long, we were talking every day, sometimes for hours, getting to know each other in a way that felt natural and easy, and after about 6 months I realized something I hadn't expected at all. I was falling in love. At that point, something had shifted for me, because I wasn't just going through the motions of daily life anymore. I was starting to think more about what the next chapter of my life might look like. And while I wasn't unhappy in the United States, I also wasn't feeling particularly excited about the future either. After my divorce, I had settled into a routine that felt comfortable but predictable, and while there was nothing wrong with that, I found myself wondering if there might still be something new ahead, even at 50, and when I started talking with her more regularly, that feeling only grew stronger. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of curiosity about what life could look like if I stepped outside of my comfort zone, and while I didn't know exactly where things were headed, I knew that I was open to the idea that life could still change, even later than I had once imagined. As our conversations continued, I found myself thinking more seriously about what this might actually mean, because this wasn't just someone who lived in another city, or even another state. She lived halfway across the world. And while I was excited, I also had questions, the kind of questions that most people probably have in a situation like this. I wondered if everything was real. I wondered if she was interested in me for the right reasons. And I wondered if something like this could actually work in real life, especially because I wasn't wealthy, I didn't have a lot of money, and I certainly wasn't someone who could offer a luxurious lifestyle. I was just an average guy trying to figure out what the next chapter of my life might look like. But the more we talked, the more those concerns started to fade, because our conversations didn't revolve around money or material things. They revolved around everyday life, family, goals, and what we both wanted for the future, and over time it started to feel more real, and eventually I decided it was time to take the next step. Planning that first trip felt exciting, but it also felt like a big step, because this wasn't just a short drive or a weekend flight. This was traveling halfway across the world to meet someone I had only known through conversations and video calls. And while I was excited, I also had that natural nervous feeling that comes with stepping into something completely new. When I finally arrived in the Philippines and met her in person for the first time, something just felt easy, and while I had prepared myself for things to be different, or even awkward, the truth was that it felt comfortable almost immediately. And over the next few weeks, I started to experience a different pace of life, one that felt slower, more relaxed, and in many ways more connected than what I had been used to back home. During my visit, we spent time not only getting to know each other better, but also exploring daily life, visiting markets, walking through neighborhoods, and spending time with her family. And as I did, I started noticing something else that I hadn't really thought much about before. The cost of living seemed significantly lower than what I was used to in the United States. It wasn't just one thing, it was everything from meals to transportation to rent, and while I wasn't thinking about moving yet, I couldn't help but notice how far money seemed to stretch compared to what I had been used to. And for the first time, the idea of living in another country started to feel less like a fantasy, and more like something that might actually be possible. But at the same time, I also knew that I wasn't retired, and I didn't have enough savings to stop working, and while I did have a 401k, I had no intention of touching it because I still wanted to continue building toward retirement, not start dipping into it earlier than I needed to. And that meant if I was ever going to make a move like this, I would need to figure out a way to keep earning an income. That realization stayed in the back of my mind as I finished my trip and eventually returned to the United States. But something had changed, because now I wasn't just thinking about my next vacation. I was thinking about the possibility of building a new life. And while that idea was exciting, it also came with a lot of questions, especially around how I would actually make it work financially. Back in the United States, I started researching what it might look like to work remotely, something I had never seriously considered before. And while the idea sounded appealing, I also had concerns, especially about internet reliability and power outages, because I had heard mixed things about working remotely from the Philippines, and the last thing I wanted to do was move halfway across the world only to find out I couldn't reliably do my job. Still, the more I looked into it, the more I realized that remote work might actually be the key to making this possible. Because if I could keep earning a steady income while living in a lower cost area, then suddenly the idea of moving at 50 didn't seem nearly as unrealistic as it once had. And for the first time, I started thinking seriously about what it would actually take to make this move happen. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that if I was going to make a move like this, I needed to be realistic, because I wasn't retiring, I wasn't wealthy, and I didn't have the kind of savings that would allow me to simply stop working. So if this was going to work, I needed a steady, reliable income. And that meant finding a full-time remote position that I could depend on long-term. At first, the idea of switching to remote work felt a little intimidating, because I had spent most of my career working in traditional office environments, and while remote work had become more common, it still felt like a big change, especially when I was also thinking about relocating to another country at the same time. But the more I researched, the more I realized that many people were already doing exactly that, working remotely from different parts of the world while maintaining steady careers. So I started looking for opportunities that would allow me to work remotely full-time, and over time I found something that felt like a good fit, something stable enough that I could rely on, but flexible enough that it would allow me to work from anywhere. And once that piece started to come together, the idea of moving to the Philippines started to feel less like a dream and more like an actual plan. Even then, I still had concerns, especially when it came to internet reliability, because I had heard stories about outages, slow connections, and unexpected service interruptions. And while I didn't doubt that many people were working remotely from the Philippines, I also knew that my job would depend heavily on having a reliable connection, and I couldn't afford to take chances. That's when I started thinking about redundancy, because if I was going to work remotely from another country, I didn't just want internet, I wanted backup plans, and then backup plans for those backup plans. So I started researching what other people were doing, and I realized that many remote workers were setting up multiple internet connections, portable power backups, and other solutions to make sure they could continue working even if something unexpected happened. Once I moved to the Philippines and settled just outside of Manila, one of the first things I focused on was setting up my home office, because I knew that having a reliable workspace would be essential if I wanted to make this lifestyle sustainable. And I started with a primary fiber internet connection, which turned out to be faster and more stable than I had expected. But I also knew that even the best connections can sometimes go down, especially when maintenance or repairs are needed. So I decided to set up a second fiber internet connection from a different provider, giving me a backup option in case the primary connection ever went offline. And while it might sound excessive, it gave me peace of mind knowing that I had redundancy built into my setup, especially since my income depended on staying connected. I also invested in a portable power station, something similar to an EcoFlow unit, along with a small solar setup, so that if the power went out, I would still be able to keep my computer, router, and essential equipment running. And while power outages weren't constant, they did happen occasionally. And having that backup meant I could continue working without worrying about interruptions. Over time, I realized that the internet in the Philippines was actually quite good, especially in the area where I was living, but I also learned that occasional outages for repairs or maintenance were part of the reality, and because I had planned ahead, those interruptions became more of a minor inconvenience rather than a major problem. With my remote job stable, my backup systems in place, and my cost of living significantly lower than what I had been used to in the United States, I found myself in a situation I hadn't expected just a year earlier, because at 50, I wasn't retiring, but I was building a new life, one where I could continue working, continue saving for retirement, and still enjoy the experience of living in another country. And perhaps the most surprising part of all was that what started as a simple conversation online had led me to a completely different path, one where I wasn't just working toward retirement, but actually enjoying the journey along the way. Today, I'm still here in the Philippines, I'm still with the girlfriend I moved here to be with, and I'm still working remotely while continuing to test the waters of living here long term. And for now, I'm still on a tourist visa, extending it as needed while I take my time and make sure this is the right long-term decision for me. I didn't rush into anything, and I think that's something that helped me the most, because moving to another country at 50 is a big life change. And giving myself time to adjust, learn, and experience daily life here has made the transition much smoother. And if I could give one piece of advice to anyone thinking about making a similar move, it would be this. There are more remote work opportunities out there than you might think, and you don't always need to pay for services that promise to help you find remote jobs, because many of those platforms charge fees just to search or apply. And in many cases, you can find those same opportunities on your own by doing a little research and applying directly. There are also a wide range of remote jobs available, from customer support to administrative roles to online tutoring or teaching. And while requirements vary, some of these positions don't always require a degree or the ability to speak multiple languages, which makes them more accessible than many people might assume. Of course, this is just based on my own experience and opinions, and everyone's situation is different, so it's always important to do your own research and make sure you understand what works best for you. But for me, finding remote work was what made this move possible, and it allowed me to start a new chapter without dipping into my retirement savings. Looking back, I never imagined that at 50 years old, I would be starting over in another country, building a new routine, setting up a remote career, and figuring things out one step at a time. But sometimes life doesn't follow the path you expected, and in my case, it opened a door I never even knew existed. Because at 50, I didn't have enough to retire, I wasn't wealthy, And I didn't have everything figured out. I was just an average guy who took a chance, found another way, and built a life that I could actually afford. And if sharing this story helps even one person realize that starting over is still possible, even at 50, then this journey will have meant even more. Because sometimes starting over isn't the end of something. Sometimes it's just the beginning.